moment in history that is unique.
It wasn't a serious disruption.
They delayed the vote, didn't they?
By 3 hours or by 4 hours.
For the first time in U.S. history, yes. That's significant. That's serious.
Why is it more significant to delay this proceeding than other congressional proceedings? Things like voting on wars or confirming Supreme Court justices are pretty serious, too, in terms of the things Congress is supposed to do under Article 1. But the reason we don't consider those protests, even though they might have delayed the proceeding some, to be historic or serious or an insurrection, is because they never posed a threat to the stability of the United States government. In order to have an actual insurrection of the kind that you want to claim this is, you would need enormous numbers of very well-trained people who are heavily armed with serious plans to go into the Capitol and overthrow the power of the United States government.
In this video, woke streamer Destiny debates Glenn Greenwald about whether or not January 6th qualifies as an actual insurrection. Glenn Greenwald asked Destiny what specifically made it an insurrection. As expected, Destiny is unable to fully articulate his point, and this gives Glenn Greenwald the opportunity to, like so many people before him, own Destiny in this debate.
This is the kind of drama queen behavior that has dominated the Trump years, where every kind of event is catastrophized to its highest extent.
So you would say that any past, so like the whiskey rebellion in the United States, that's stupid. They shouldn't have called it that. They should have called it like the farmer protest or something different, or because what you're saying right now, it stands in contrast to how every other person viewed insurrectionism or insurrectionists at the time when, say, the 14th Amendment was drafted and ratified. People viewed people sometimes as being insurrectionary or giving aid or comfort to enemies of the United States just for letting their children go off to war to serve the Confederacy. It's nice if you, Glenn Greenwald, personally have some view of what you personally think an insurrectionist or rebellion might look like or what it should be, but to be quite frank, your opinion doesn't really matter. The opinion would be the historical relevance of the saying in the United States. It would be the historical analysis that exists for historical rebellions or insurrections in the United States, which oftentimes had very little to no chance of succeeding. Even the insurrectionists themselves thought that they were going to succeed. And we would use that analysis that exists at the time when, say, the 14th Amendment was ratified, and then we would use that going forward to figure out what do we think an insurrection and a rebellion is. And again, you can try to minimize and you can try to call it ideological and whatever you want. None of those congressional protests that you mentioned in the past rose to a level where tens of thousands of protesters were violently breaking into Congress and delaying the certification of the presidential vote.
You just got done saying that the maximum number of people who entered the Capitol was 2,000, and now you're calling it tens of thousands of people because you know so well. In fact, you conceded in the very first question I asked you that of course there has to be a quantitative component in terms of the gravity of the threat in order to seriously call it an insurrection or a coup, which is why I began by asking you whether or not if two people armed with knives went to the Congress and demanded that Donald Trump be removed after he was declared the winner and threatened to use violence with their knives, whether that would in the history books or by our major newspapers be referred to as the United States fighting off a coup or an insurrection. And you said,
I think what they're arguing is what are the components needed to classify something as an insurrection. And we'll see exactly what they say moving forward. But I've always said that if an insurrection was planned by these folks on January 6th, like Glenn Greenwald said, wouldn't they have been heavily armed and had an intricate plan to overthrow the government of the biggest superpower in the world? And I think Glenn Greenwald makes another point. Again, I don't at all approve of any actions on January 6th that were violent or damaging property or physically harming anyone, especially policemen. But Glenn Greenwald does make a good point that it was a 3 to 4 hour disruption. And there are plenty other congressional processes over the years that have been delayed and no one had a second thought about them. And before we get back to the video, last thing I'll say is Glenn Greenwald mentioned something like people acting like drama queens over January 6th. And I agree. I think the Democrats do that all the time. And one of the worst outcomes of January 6th to me is that it just gives the left something to hold over the right's head when we have so many things. So It's like their racism, sexism arguments. The second you bring up January 6th, or you call someone a racist, or you call someone a sexist, it stops the actual substantive debate, and then the person's on the defensive. Because in my opinion, the right has so much wrongdoing to point at in the Democrat Party that they need to take anything they can to have something to throw back in the face of the right. And like I said, that's one of the tragedies that came out of this, is now they have this thing they can always point to, and they've built up the narrative so much that it's the worst thing in history that forces Republicans to be defensive about it. Anyway, let's get back to the video.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if it's just two people, then it would probably be pretty ridiculous to call it that. So I see this, what happened on January 6th, a 3-hour riot that even the FBI's informants on the ground told the FBI in real time was never intended to be any kind of premeditated violent act on the part of most people, but instead was something that happened spontaneously, as so often happens where political protests confront the police and become violent. I see it much more akin to the kind of ridiculous example that I began by asking you, where you conceded that wouldn't be called an insurrection, than I do some kind of Civil War type situation, or even a meaningful armed rebellion of the kind that happened in Russia last year, where even that was crushed in 12 hours.
Are you familiar with Loki's wager?
Explain it to me.
So I think Loki makes a wager with two dwarves or whatever, and eventually they say that they can cut his head off. It comes to the point to where he loses the wager. They go to collect their bet, and when they're trying to figure out how to cut his head off, they're arguing over what part of the neck is when the head starts, and then the rest of the neck begins, basically. And the argument he eventually makes is, well, you can't take even a centimeter, an inch of my neck, therefore you're not allowed to cut my head off. You're trying to argue right now that because I might not consider 2 people an insurrection, that I can't possibly consider 2,000 people an insurrection. That's the same as you saying, since I can't tell precisely where your head ends and your neck begins, I might say that your toe is part of your head. This argument is nonsense, and the only way that you can make the argument is to continue to try to make comparisons to other more extreme coups or more intense insurrectionist attempts, which I agree. There can be more extreme insurrectionist attempts. There can be more extreme coups. But the reality is, even if you want to wind it all the way back down, even if you want it all the way back down, say, like, okay, we'll ignore the tens of thousands of protesters outside. We can just go with 2,000 people. Glenn, how are you seriously going to argue that 2,000 people inside the Capitol with the goal of delaying the certification of the...
If you like watching videos like these, like and subscribe. We'd really appreciate it. Let's get back to the video.
The vote, which they accomplished, doesn't represent an insurrection.
Wait, so Glenn, just before you go on, I just want to put you on Glenn's question. So Glenn's question was, he said, an insurrection when there's an actual threat to democracy. I'm pushing off that a vote isn't a threat to democracy. At what point did you call it an insurrection? Would you call it an insurrection on January 6th?
I don't know, like, here's the thing. I don't know the thin line that they'd have to cross to call it an insurrection, but whatever line that is, it was crossed a long time ago. You had the President of the United States calling up over 100,000 people to D.C., and then he riled them up saying that they needed to essentially delay the vote. He was relying on Pence to do it. All of those protesters went to the White House. A lot of them, or not to the White House, sorry, to the Capitol building. A lot of them broke into the Capitol building with the goal of delaying the certification of the vote because they didn't like the outcome of the election and they wanted to change it. They needed to fight like hell to take their country back because Mike Pence wasn't going to do the right thing by helping Trump do his constitutional coup. And so they turned it into an insurrection. It's plenty of what happened. Now, if only 20 people went in, would I consider it an insurrection? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. If only, 100 people went in, maybe. Maybe if 200 people went in and they got further, maybe. I'm not sure where exactly I would, slice the pie to call it, whatever we call it. But wherever we're at, we're way, 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 way over that. And I just don't think the comparisons to other more extreme coups or more extreme rebellions or anything in Russia, it just doesn't make any sense. It's only done to equivocate on what's actually happened or to do a whataboutism to something that I would probably plainly agree with. Like, wouldn't you agree this is a more serious coup or more serious insurrection? Yeah, sure, there can be more serious coups and more serious insurrections. Much the same, there could be more brutal murders of one person and other. It doesn't make one murder not a murder just because you did it easier or did it cleaner.
Okay, so first of all, the reason, as I said at the start, why historical comparisons or historic comparisons to other incidents are so important is because there's a gigantic ideological and partisan motive here and exaggerating the extent to which what happened on January 6th was a serious threat. And especially when somebody is a Democratic Party partisan who goes around saying the Democratic Party is better, we want people to go and vote for Democrats, we want to make sure.
You know, I've always said in the past that my belief was that this was a protest, and then a couple bad apples in the crowd started getting into it with law enforcement, and it eventually turned into a riot where, again, property was damaged and people were physically harmed, as well as police. But if what I just said is true, to me that's classified as a protest gone wrong. Very wrong, if you want to say that, but not a planned insurrection. And that's just what I've always said. But the fact that Glenn Greenwald said that FBI informants on the ground told their superiors or whomever that it was not a planned attack on the Capitol, it was something that spontaneously occurred, like what I just described, which was my assumption of what happened. To me, that's even more evidence that this was just a handful of unruly people that took things too far, and I don't agree with it all, but I've just seen nothing that pushes this incident to the level of insurrection. And comparing January 6th to other incidents is not irrelevant, as Destiny says, because if those examples are classified as insurrection, then you have something to compare it to. Because Destiny already admitted that he doesn't know exactly what the line is that needs to be crossed to classify something as an insurrection. So I think examples, like in the housing market, right? Like, call them comps. You know, you try to value a house and you look at a comp, a comparable house, and what's it priced at. So it at least gives some reference or starting point on, all right, does this classify as an insurrection? Let's get back to the video.
Sure, Donald Trump doesn't return to power. And at the same time, the narrative they're pushing coincidentally aligns perfectly with their partisan agenda. Then I think it's important to start questioning whether or not there's any authenticity to the beliefs based on how other situations have previously been treated. So let me just make 2 points here about what Donald Trump did. You're actually allowed to summon people to Washington to protest. It's one of the most important rights that the Constitution guarantees. The president is completely free to call his supporters to Washington and to tell them and argue for them that some injustice has been committed and that they ought to protest in response to it. There was one time, and only one time, when Donald Trump addressed the question of whether or not violence should be used when those people went to the Capitol. And what he said was this, quote, "I know that everybody here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard." And the fact that people, because he said peacefully, then have to resort to things like, oh, well, he invoked political cliches like fight like hell. Politicians use fight like hell in almost every.
Yeah, Glenn Greenwald makes a good point. Donald Trump did tell people to be peaceful, and I believe he referenced that we, meaning the Republicans, are the party of law and order. And Glenn Greenwald is right. That's why that term fight like hell comes up all the time, because they have to have something to point at to say, oh, look, he incited it. But any of us could go online right now and within an hour have a montage of 100 politicians, activists, or whomever using the word fight or using the words fight like hell without any connotation of violence. So it's a weak argument. Anyway, that's it for this video. Let us know what you think. Whose side are you on? Destiny's or Glenn Greenwald? Did it rise to the level of an insurrection, or has it been overblown by the media and liberals? As always, we really appreciate you watching, and we'll see you on the next one.